Mayor, before I start tonight, I want to apologize. There's an error on my submission. I put the name Master Garden, I have no idea why, and I left off the name of our late councillor, Ron Call-Jen. So I'm here tonight to address the issue of electronic voting. I'd like to thank you all for your progressive nature and your willingness to challenge the status quo. I appreciate policymakers that are able to think forward and make changes to our existing paradigm. And I hope our new councillor will be as willing to consider alternatives during their decision-making duties. Specifically regarding the issue of electronic voting, this change was recommended by administration in a report dated December 3rd, 2013. As a result, this council passed a bylaw authorizing the use of this alternative voting method. Tonight I'm going to speak to this report that led to the passing of bylaw 110-2013, and in understanding that nothing this council decides is binding on the next council, I will keep the bulk of my research and evidence regarding electronic voting in general and the foreign-owned company cited for the new council if I'm fortunate enough to address them on this issue in the new year. The report to council does acknowledge the concerns of electronic voting being that of security, privacy, and integrity, and claims that the software company's product addresses these concerns. Prior to the election, I asked administration a few questions that have not yet been answered. On the issue of security, I asked how this election process can ensure that malware is not present on individual computers or phones of the voting public. This is the most difficult link to protect when it comes to electronic voting. Malware could alter a voter's vote without anyone knowing. It could record voting activity, or even display a ballot image on your screen that does not correspond to the data that's actually transmitted to the election server. On the issue of integrity, I asked what recourse candidates or the residents have for requesting a recount as prescribed in the Municipal Elections Act. Auditability means that there must be an independent and documented means of publicly verifying and recounting votes to confirm the results of an election. I also asked if any experts in the field were consulted before or during the decision to change our election process. And that brings me to the content of my submission to Council on November 3rd, whereby I referenced an independent review of CITL's election products conducted for the City of Toronto by computer scientists from Concordia and Western University, the results of which was a 40-plus page report with a recommendation that the City not proceed with electronic voting, citing security, privacy, and integrity issues that the software companies are unable to satisfactorily address. It seems that Kingsville and the other two local municipalities who used electronic voting had conducted an independent review of this process. We likely wouldn't be here discussing this issue today, and we wouldn't have candidates in all three municipalities challenging the election process and the results. I don't know if spending taxpayer money on a review at this point is necessary, given how we've now tried and tested this process ourselves, and given that an expert review of CITL's products and others are available for free. The review I cite in my submission is not the only one I've been able to find. Returning to the administration report, the listed benefits of this voting method include making voting more accessible. We've heard from our senior population that the opposite is the case. And given the issue with mail delays for personal identification numbers requiring residents to go to town hall during their business hours, potentially missing work in order to get the required credentials to exercise their vote, this is not exactly an accessible process for all. Another stated benefit is voter turnout would improve. Kingsville has consistently had voter turnout results that are greater than the provincial average, but the turnout for this election was lower than the elections from the previous decade, and instead returned to similar rates as the last time Kingsville used paper ballots in the election of 2000. As I've been reading through the available relevant literature on alternative voting methods, I've discovered that voter turnout is the result of many factors that has little to do with the voting process. Isolating these variables that affect voter turnout seem near impossible, including such things as the mayoral race, campaigning efforts, specific election issues, and the timing of other government elections. More so than these variables, it seems the culture of participation in a community is a factor, and is likely why Kingsville has typically outperformed the provincial average for voter turnout, that is, until the 2014 election. When I contacted our archive department, I was informed that the voter turnout for elections in the late 1980s was at or near 60%. So it seems when elections were held more regularly, of participation was even greater, and the electorate was more engaged in their democracy. I know that the frequency of elections is not this council's control, but all this speaks to the need to increase participation in democracy throughout the term. Some studies suggest that attending polling stations results in constituents engaging in the democratic process as a collective, which increases the feeling of inclusion and commonality and can lead to increasing of social networks. One study argues that civic engagement reaches a culmination during elections and that this may be lost with online voting. In an attempt to make voting more convenient, we can actually reduce our culture of participation. Another benefit of this voting method is the timeliness of election results. It was stated that results should be available within minutes. Of course, we all know that the private software company managing our election claims anomalies on election night that delayed results. We're told that they had to rerun the process to ensure the integrity of the results. But it didn't take just a few more extra minutes to rerun the process a second time. It took hours. And we received our results later than our neighbors who kept the process in the hands of locals. When we look at our contract with Cycle, it seems we have no guarantee that their product will provide any level of quality, and there are no penalties for their failure to meet any criteria. There is record of at least 21 communities reporting delay problems as a result of file naming protocols with human intervention. It is unclear who the files are being managed by when the breach occurred, and of course the errors in data management can lead to devastating results. Did Kingsville voters elect the mayor of Tecumseh? With the back-end system activity and full control of a private software company, we can't know, and this speaks directly to the integrity of the election process. To be clear, when I finally did receive my PIN after visiting Town Hall twice, I did not find voting online to be at all difficult, and I have no problem using the internet. Indeed, it's the World Wide Web that has allowed me to research this process and the company that we outsourced our democracy to. But it was not any easier than putting an X on a piece of paper. And it certainly was not an ease and a convenience that was worth the risk to our democracy, especially given the concerns of security, privacy, and integrity. And so I propose and ask this council to support the following. Whereas council received a petition prior to the election calling for a paper ballot option, and whereas voter turnout was lower than previous elections in our community, and whereas the security of individual electronic devices used by the electorate cannot be guaranteed, and whereas our election results were delayed for reasons outside of our control, with no guarantee from or penalty to the software company Cycle, and where we have no method of auditing or verifying results independent of the private software company's data, now therefore that the Council of the Town of Kingsville rescind bylaw 110-2013 that allows for this alternative voting method. And while I do hope our new council is as progressive and forward-thinking as this current council, I urge them to adopt new technologies with precaution and in a responsible manner so as to ensure the integrity of future elections and the protection of our democratic process. Thank you. I think Debbie has a question.
Senator Shaw.
I would like to give the councillors the right to change voting back to the paper ballot in the council, the current, before the new takes over.
Procedurally, we can't do that because of the reconsideration, and we've already dealt with the reconsideration question for this council. The new council will have the full slate open for any choice or options that they so choose in the future, but this council can't revisit its decision already, so we've already reconsidered it once during this term. So under our procedure body, we can't. There's no benefit to doing it here. The next council will certainly address it.
Well, when I was here before, you told me it was rejected 3 times already, and yet in the paper it's once.
It's only been reconsidered once at this table.
You know, but I was told 3 times, and it couldn't be done again.
Right. The public record shows when the decision was made, it was October 2013. We were going to the alternative method. In 2014, earlier this year, I believe it was June, the question came back to reconsider it. All the reconsideration was approved to discuss it, but no direction or change was approved by the council out here. There was no majority decision to change. So from that reconsideration, that's all that's permitted under the procedure bylaw is one reconsideration on the same issue.
Well, I hope that council takes more time to look at things, check it out.
Absolutely, I know that our administration will be providing a full review of the election from this past experience member for the new council members. So they'll have a full report based on voter turnout, response, feedback from the community, letters, correspondence that have been received, including words today will be filed with our clerk, so that we will have it together into one comprehensive presentation to all new members of council. Sorry, December 1st, next week.
You'll see us back here.
No problem, we expect it. Any questions to Ms. Young at this time? There is a second delegation speaking to the same thing before we deal with any questions that the council would like to ask of Young. Seeing that. Stand by.